Hi, this PowerPoint is about metacognition, what I sometimes call the quote, sometimes superhero of comprehension. And I contend that this topic is, of this half of the semester, the most challenging because we have to figure out what metacognition is, how does it actually happen? And it's, while many of us have some general idea about this idea of thinking about thinking, it's much more involved than that. And so we're going to break in this PowerPoint, we're going to break it down. So I want to begin by distinguishing between the idea of cognition and metacognition. So cognition is the processes that we use to come to know and understand things. So when we talked at the beginning of the semester about dual coding theory, schema theory, even our socio-cognitive theories of sociocultural and Vygotsky or Bandura's self-efficacy, that was about learning. And so learning is cognitive. How do we learn things? But metacognition is about understanding how our brains, not how our brains work, but part of that, but and also understanding how we as individuals learn and understand, so we understand how to apply learning strategies. So it is not about the stuff with learning, it's about the learning itself. So metacognition refers to the mental processes that we use to evaluate our own understanding or ways of understanding. And leads me to the question of metacognition also refers to know that one knows and understands something, and to know that one doesn't know. So if we refer back to the readings early in the semester by Keene of Essence of Understanding, and she broke down several different dimensions of understanding. And if we, for example, to dwell, to struggle, to feel, to discuss, those were ways to understand, to come to know things. And if we involved these different dimensions, then we would understand better. Now, recognizing that we need to do these kinds of things to understand, that's metacognitive, to recognize what we need to do to learn. That's metacognitive, where we focus on the stuff, content literacy, anatomy, the psychomotor methods. That's the stuff that we learn. But how we learn, that's metacognitive. So metacognition then refers to the knowledge of our readers' cognitive processes around reading and learning in general. It also involves the self-control mechanisms we use or exercise or don't when monitoring regulating text comprehension. So if you refer back to our discussion about motivation, engagement, and self-efficacy, we can recall that those who are much more self-efficacious had more motivation. And part of that was demonstrated through this self-control mechanisms, through this self-regulation of behavior to achieve one's goal. So self-efficacy is the belief one can, but part of that then belief is then the actualization, the use of the mechanisms to do so. Now, metacognition is how we actually monitor and self-control, particularly related to text comprehension. So looking at this slide, we have, it's like, so we can think about different ideas that break down what metacognition is. So we have the intentional thinking about how you think and learn, whereas cognition is your thinking activities and processes. There's the distinction. So this is the what, the cognition. The metacognition is about the how. So then the speech bubbles are some of those elements about thinking how you think and learn. What are steps that I need to follow here? I'm wondering about What do I already know about this topic? That should cue schema theory. Where did I get stuck when trying to solve this problem? It reminds me of, now we're dealing with text and connections. What is the assignment asking me to do? What's its purpose? What am I supposed to be trying to accomplish? I am figuring out. So these are elements that we think about when we approach a learning task, what we need to understand about ourselves, about the purpose, about the task, about the assessments. All of those inform how we think and learn, not the stuff. So I have had a talk about the aspects of metacognition, which is going to connect to metacognition cycle, which I'm going to come back to in just a second. So we've been talking about the overarching element of metacognition as the understanding of the processes by which we can regulate and self-control mechanisms of how we learn. Now, I like to break it down to two kind of subcomponents: metacognitive awareness and metacognitive monitoring. Metacognitive awareness is that the idea that we need to kind of wake up. So the first part, if we go back to knowing about the reading and exercising while monitoring, regulating text comprehensions. But to have such mechanisms and to ask such questions, we have to be alert. We have to be actively engaged readers, not passive readers. So, but most of the time, metacognitive awareness doesn't come into play until all of a sudden we realize that we're not. And so I have different times have read a section. So I'm going to mimic again in a second. So this is out of Buell text, and I'm just opening them to a random page. It is actually from our chapter this week. As discussed above, a critical realm of historical questioning centers on authority. Students read history that is a reflection of the ideas and perspectives of specific observers, participants, and historians. Not surprisingly, then, their largest array of focus questions are cluttered at the evaluating level, prompting students to bring a critical literacy awareness to their study of history. These questions guide readers into noticing an author at work, developing sensitivity to author's purposes and point of view, blah, blah, blah. Now, I have done this kind of read aloud before to highlight the lack of intonation, lack of prosody, so that when you are, reading and you start zoning out because there's no change of intonation, kind of like Charlie Brown's teacher, rah, 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 or a professor where, they put you to sleep because they're talking in a monologic, so they're talking in a monotone voice. Da, 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 da. Oftentimes, we often read the same way. And when we do that, we're putting ourselves to sleep, literally. But on to the other part of that, then, because we talk about that as decoding the print rather than meaning making. Very little meaning making going on in this section. I knew how to do with history and reading strategies of history, but that's about all I got out of it, because I wasn't paying attention. We have to be aware. When we are aware, we can recognize when we stumble, when things break down. But most of us aren't aware until we get to a point in time. It's like, oh, bleep, I didn't realize, I have no clue what I just read. And so then some of you maybe use stronger language, but I have generally called that the oh shit moment. The oh shit, I have no clue what I just read. So now if I want to be get the points or whatever it is I'm trying to accomplish, then I have to reread the section. So I call that the oh shit moment, when we become more metacognitively aware of what's going on. And most of us aren't aware until that happens, unless we already have an intrinsic interest and we have a strong purpose, we have a strong interest, we're highly engaged. And so then we just, the flow, the purpose, it all moves smoothly, and we're aware that we understand because we're still moving forward. Our brains are awake. But in this case, brain was not awake, voice was going, print was going, it's like eyes processing print, but very little meaning making going on. So, and as we said, if there's no meaning making, we actually hadn't read. So that leads us to, so that's metacognitive awareness. which leads us to metacognitive monitoring. And I liken that to the metaphor of the police car. So if you think about usually when we are, if you have been driving to DeKalb, and many of you are not right now, but thinking coming from Rockford area, Cherry Valley to Annie Glidden or Plank Road, or all of a sudden now you coming from 88 and to 38. And all of a sudden there's those places, particularly like on Annie Glidden, where it goes from 55 to 30, 35 pretty darn quickly. And you have to be paying attention to recognize that the speed limits are decreasing significantly. And otherwise, if you don't, you're going to get stopped. So all of a sudden we hear the siren and we understand what it means. Understand though, the individual persona, the authority that is regulating our speeding behavior is the police, and or the threat of a ticket. So we pay attention because we don't want those. So we pay attention to our speeds, but it is externally regulated so that then we come into compliance. Oftentimes when teachers talk about metacognition, they are actually still in control. They are doing the questioning. They are responding to and evaluating the questions, the responses of the students. They are in control by and large of what's going on and directing. That's not metacognitive, because metacognitive is self-driven, self-regulated, not externally regulated. So this is like it now, if we are our own police car and we are regulating ourselves, then that's metacognitive. So we have metacognitive awareness and monitoring, where instead of having an external authority like the police force or like a teacher, now we become regulating our own understanding ourselves. So this leads to metacognition cycle, where we assess the task, whether that could be in a given assignment, it could be a final exam, it could be an individual reading a task. It could be a plan, goal setting and fitness plan. Okay, evaluating of strengths and weaknesses. So if you're thinking about, as we usually do at this point in time, is getting close to the end of the semester, thinking about different exams and projects going on, strengths and weaknesses. What is going to be harder? What's going to be easier? What is, as far as the assignment tasks, where are your grades? You're evaluating strengths and weaknesses in comparison to yourself and to the other assigned tasks, and your time priorities. Those have to come into play as well. So then planning, how are you going to deal with it all? Applying strategies, and this is the part though we often don't do in reading, is apply knowing strategies, because when we read, we recognize that we're going to read a informational text that we need to learn from differently than we do for pleasure. So we don't necessarily assess the task, evaluate strengths, weaknesses, and plan the approach. Oftentimes when we have inherent interest, those are more subconscious and automatic, and it's not really paid attention to. It's when things are challenging. This is when this is really important. So then what strategies matter? So if we understand the task and that its purpose, where do we lie as far as time-wise, our strengths, weaknesses, then we can apply and plan and then apply the strategies we need. We need to allow more time. We need to turn off the television. We need to turn away from the phone. We need to use the writing center, whatever it is. And then reflecting. So how did that go? Did that work? So if we are talking about literacy strategies and we apply a new literacy tool, did it work? Did it benefit? Great, then let's make sure we use it again. That's the idea of the metacognition cycle. So then we have the idea here of the critical awareness of our thinking and learning, and oneself as a thinker and a learner. So that's the idea of metacognition awareness and monitoring. And the cycle is that we understand how we think and learn, and what the task is, the assignments are required for that, and ourselves. So metacognitive monitoring, we can think about the is highly distinctive and differentiated by, not surprisingly, strong, competent readers and struggling readers. Strong readers realize when they have a breakdown in comprehension. And here's the critical thing, though. They do something about it. They employ some kind of repair strategy, like reread the passage, adjust their reading rate. So sometimes if it's a harder task, then we need to slow down. Oftentimes, if it's really tough, then I need to read it aloud because, again, I'm now hearing. And so it's both the auditory processing and the visual processing that helps me. Maybe consult an expert. That would be, whether it's Wikipedia, don't cite, but use it as background, some informational summaries, internet, maybe it's looking up at, watching videos for some background. Looking up an unknown word, I consider that an expert as well, as far as a dictionary source, thesaurus. So these are things that active readers usually will often do. However, struggling readers, very little monitoring. So then that's when it says, I can decode well, but I just didn't get it. When it may be a distraction. That's why we did the metacognitive log, if you recall, at the beginning of the semester. So you can pay attention to what is working and what is not working in your favor. And that struggling readers focus and see reading as a decoding process, a completion process, rather than a meaning-making process. So if you use, if you engage in tasks for reading as decoding and to get it through it, you're never going to understand, you're never going to improve. That's like, trying to do weight lifts and never putting on any significant weight, because it's, and struggling readers then also seem to not realize that they don't understand because there's no active processes going on. You're just getting through it. The eyes are going across, and that's presuming reading, and then don't realize that they don't really don't understand. And so then fail to exercise control of the reading processes. And also, if you remember, we talked about the differences earlier in the semester with struggling readers and proficient readers, and particularly in relationship to the Matthew effect and that spiral, is one of the key elements is that lack of control that struggling readers feel. So that they have no sense of there's no strong self-efficacy, no identity, and no sense of control. And so these are important elements to facilitate. As physical educators, that's one of the reasons that you end up breaking down skills, is to help students be able to metacognitively break down the parts. So I want you to consider this. How would or could struggling readers not realize that they don't understand? Under what circumstances might that occur? And similarly, so then Tavani kind of asks, sadly, many of my students don't expect to understand what they read. And again, why do you think that is? And from a different article, in a couple of different locations, there's been talking about metacognition as different voices. So we've talked about word calling in the beginning of the semester, and that is a relationship to a recitational. So thinking about when I just read aloud from Buell's text, I was word calling. There was no meaning making going on. So, and the primary purpose, if you will, is to get through an assignment. It's to complete, not to understand. So there's the recitational voice, the da 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 da, that has no prosody, is decoding print without any real sense of comprehension. Compared to a conversational voice, which is what we actually want, where we are interacting with the text. We're talking back to the page. I might, if I'm talking to, thinking about the Buell text, instead of I'll call him Doug. What do you mean by this? Or Chris, to Vonnie's text, her first name is Chris. Chris, I don't get why you said this. So calling sometimes, thinking about calling the author by the first name, partly then switches the sense of authority that the text might have, and then starts engaging. So talking back to the words on the page, asking questions, critiquing information. What do you mean by this? I don't get this. Connecting the ideas with personal experiences or other information. Oh, that makes sense to me because I had this experience, blah, 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 blah. So that's a conversational voice. And the conversational voice, when we have that going on, then we know that we're being metacognitive because our brains are processing and applying and connecting. They're all doing all of these really powerful cognitive tasks all at the same time. So then, I want you also to consider what's involved in a good conversation. What happens to meaning making and comprehension in a one-sided conversation? And what are some of the results? How can reading be like this? So as we're finishing up, metacognitive monitoring enables students to gain a sense of control over their reading processes through awareness of comprehension. When we think aloud, and think aloud is what we talk about, where we think aloud through a text or problem or situation. So in physical education, this might be like thinking through a strategy unit, a tactics-based curricular unit. So think alouds model the skills and processes that experts in the discipline use to approach a problem, and then as well as confront breakdowns in understanding. So then thinking about doing critical elements and the cues that we use in physical education for those critical elements. Then think aloud is where a young person might be thinking, okay, I'm going to do a free throw. I know, these are the critical elements. And you as a teacher thinking aloud in your stance, or if you're doing a swing, the bat, if you're doing a throw, where's your hand, where's your fingers, what's the position, what moves first, what moves last, all of those different elements. That's part of those critical elements is you're essentially then thinking aloud, not just demonstrating, but thinking aloud as the participant might, and do so. So then you can show the reader, in this case, show your students what it means to feel like. So part of metacognition is trying to figure out how to break skills down and be actively engaged. In physical education, that might be more often about how and why do we do things. Physical education has largely been about showing, but has not been a lot about explaining why. And the breakdown of the why is really important for a lot of students to be able to comprehend. So that's part and parcel of both the reading comprehension and how that applies into physical education settings.